The 1950s looked safe in old photos of families lined up in their Sunday best. Shiny cars parked outside neat little houses, soda fountains buzzing with laughter. It was a time painted in soft colors, where life seemed simpler and full of promise. The war was over, and people believed in a brighter future. Yet beneath those polished snapshots, the everyday reality of the decade was filled with habits, risks, and freedoms that would shock us now. What once felt ordinary, even wholesome, has since been outlawed for good reason. The decade began with a wave of post-war optimism. Soldiers returned home, suburbs spread across the country, and families embraced a vision of stability and tradition. Main streets thrived, television sets flickered in living rooms, and the American dream felt within reach for millions. Mothers prepared casseroles, fathers cut the grass, and children played outside until the streetlights came on. The nation seemed wrapped in a blanket of safety and belonging. But safety, as it turned out, was more a feeling than a fact. Much of daily life was built on trust in government, in doctors, in products on store shelves. People believed the experts and rarely questioned whether what they were told was true. Food was eaten without labels, medicine was taken without warnings, and household items were used without second thoughts. If it was advertised in a magazine or sold at the local pharmacy, people assumed it was safe. Behind that trust, though, lay a lack of rules that today would be unthinkable. Parents lit cigarettes in the living room while children played on the floor. Gasoline contained lead that filled the air. Cars gleamed with chrome but offered no seatbelts or airbags. Schools kept strict order with wooden paddles. The habits were so woven into daily life that they felt harmless, even natural. Looking back, it is almost hard to believe how normal danger once felt. Still, the culture of the 1950s was about more than risk. It was about belonging. Families were held together by strong traditions, church on Sundays, and neighborhood ties. People knew their mailman, trusted their milkman, and let their kids roam without fear. There was comfort in the routines, even if some of those routines carried unseen costs. For many, life in the 1950s was defined less by fear of harm and more by the promise of progress. Today, the contrast is striking. Warning labels cover almost everything, from children's toys to household cleaners. Cars are designed with layers of safety features. Laws regulate how we eat, drive, work, and even play. Much of this change protects us, but it also shows just how different life was in the 1950s. Back then, people lived with risks they didn't even recognize. What they saw as normal, we now see as reckless. And it all begins with the medicine cabinet, where science sometimes went too far. Imagine your doctor handing you a cigarette and calling it healthy. That was not just a joke or a wild story from the past. It was the reality of 1950s America. Tobacco wasn't just accepted, it was encouraged, and sometimes even prescribed. Glossy advertisements showed physicians in white coats smiling with cigarettes in hand, telling patients that one brand soothed the throat or helped with stress. The message was clear. If the doctor said it was fine, then lighting up must be perfectly safe. Cigarettes were everywhere. They sat in vending machines at bus stations, grocery stores, and even schools. There were no warning labels, no grim pictures on packs, no reminders about cancer or lung disease. A pack of smokes was as ordinary a purchase as a carton of milk. In some neighborhoods, children would walk into the corner store and buy cigarettes for their parents, no questions asked. The clerk knew the family and trusted the request. Nobody thought twice about it. The casual nature of smoking was woven into the fabric of daily life. Business meetings were conducted across clouds of smoke. Airplanes offered ashtrays at every seat, buses smelled of tobacco, and even hospitals allowed patients and visitors to puff away. Cigarette breaks were not just permitted. They were practically built into the rhythm of the day. Movies glamorized it, celebrities endorsed it, and the act of smoking became tied to sophistication, relaxation, and even health. It was not only socially acceptable, it carried no stigma at all. Lighting up in front of children in a crowded restaurant or while standing in a hospital ward was considered normal. Non-smokers simply tolerated the haze because that was how life worked. There was little understanding of secondhand smoke, and no movement yet to protect those who didn't choose the habit. At the time, smoking wasn't seen as a danger, but as a personal choice that came with a touch of glamour and independence. Looking back, it is startling to realize how deeply tobacco was woven into public spaces. The idea that someone could smoke in a hospital bed or during a cross-country flight feels almost unthinkable today. Over the decades, research revealed the damage cigarettes caused, and public attitudes shifted. What once symbolized status and calm came to represent danger, addiction, and corporate deception. Now, cigarettes are banned in airplanes, buses, restaurants, hospitals, schools, and most workplaces. The shift was dramatic, but it didn't happen overnight. Laws came slowly, pushed forward by scientific evidence and public health campaigns. Today, smoking is restricted, heavily taxed, and labeled with stark warnings. The world that once allowed anyone to light up anywhere is gone, remembered mostly through faded ads and old films. But tobacco wasn't the only danger lurking in the 1950s home. Sometimes, the real risks came not from a cigarette in hand, but from the so-called cures sitting inside the medicine cabinet. From radium water to miracle pills, the 1950s medicine cabinet could be deadly. At a time when science was trusted without question, anything labeled as modern or advanced carried an air of progress. Families believed new products would make them healthier, stronger, or slimmer. But behind the glossy advertisements and doctor endorsements was a dangerous truth. Many of these so-called cures were barely tested, and some were outright harmful. What sat on a shelf in a neighborhood drugstore could have effects far worse than the illness it claimed to treat. One of the strangest examples was the continued fascination with radiation. Even after the dangers of exposure were becoming clearer in medical circles, the 1950s still saw products like radium water and uranium-laced tonics marketed as vitality boosters. People drank them in hopes of adding energy to their days, unaware they were swallowing substances now recognized as highly dangerous. Some cosmetics and health devices even promised glowing skin or relief from arthritis by using radioactive elements. To a generation raised on optimism, these risks were invisible, buried under promises of science-made miracles. The obsession with quick fixes did not end there. Diet culture was growing, especially for women, and the shelves were filled with miracle pills that promised fast weight loss. Many of these pills contained amphetamines, essentially speed in a bottle. Doctors prescribed them liberally, and women used them daily without realizing the addictive nature or long-term damage. What was sold as a harmless tool for staying slim was, in truth, a dangerous stimulant that could alter both body and mind. Even children were not spared from risky remedies. Common cough syrups often contained codeine, an opioid. Parents gave spoonfuls to their kids without hesitation, because that was simply how things were done. No one thought twice about handing children medicine that today would be considered too strong, even for adults without a prescription. These syrups dulled symptoms but left young bodies exposed to substances that could cause dependency. It was a gamble wrapped in a comforting label. Perhaps the most haunting example was thalidomide, prescribed to pregnant women to ease morning sickness. At first, it seemed like a wonder drug, safe, effective, and widely available. But by the early 1960s, the horrifying consequences were clear. Thousands of babies born with severe birth defects. The tragedy shook public trust and became one of the major catalysts for stricter drug regulations in the United States. In the 1950s, however, it was just another pill passed across the counter, taken with confidence in the experts. What tied all these dangers together was the lack of oversight. The Food and Drug Administration existed, but it did not yet demand the rigorous testing and clinical trials required today. Companies rushed products to market, fueled by profit and the nation's excitement for scientific progress. Families paid the price for that blind trust, often without ever realizing the risks they had taken. Looking back, the 1950s medicine cabinet was less a place of healing and more a reflection of the era's unchecked faith in science. It was a time when trust replaced caution, and danger often came disguised as progress. And if the pills didn't get you, the cars just might. Families piled into shiny Chevys, no seatbelts, no car seats, no second thoughts. In the 1950s, the open road represented freedom, and Americans embraced it without hesitation. Cars were symbols of status, style, and success. They gleamed with chrome, roared with powerful engines, and promised adventure with every turn of the key. Safety, however, was rarely part of the conversation. A family could drive across the country without a single thought of restraints or protective gear. The road was an open invitation, but it was also a place of hidden danger. Seatbelts were not standard equipment. In fact, most cars did not even offer them until the late 1950s, and even then, they were seen as optional add-ons, often ignored by buyers. To most people, the idea of strapping themselves into a car felt unnecessary, even uncomfortable. Children rode on laps, perched in the front seats, or climbed freely in the back. Pickup trucks carried kids sitting along the edge of the bed, hair blowing in the wind as the highway stretched ahead. For parents, this wasn't reckless. It was normal. The design of the cars themselves made crashes even more dangerous. Interiors were built with hard steel dashboards, sharp knobs, and solid steering columns that turned collisions into catastrophic events. There were no airbags, no crumple zones, and no headrest to soften the impact. A sudden stop could send passengers flying forward, yet the sense of invincibility behind the wheel made people believe such accidents were unlikely. Drunk driving was another hazard treated with astonishing casualness. Having a few beers before heading home was seen as part of social life, not a crime. Police rarely cracked down on drivers who had been drinking, and the dangers were underestimated by a culture that prized independence and personal choice over regulation. Roads filled with confident drivers who thought little about the risks, even as accidents claimed thousands of lives each year. Car culture itself celebrated speed, daring. Drive-in movies, drag races, and joyrides defined teenage life, while families proudly took Sunday drives just for the pleasure of it. The thrill of the open road was inseparable from the decade's identity. Ads focused on horsepower, size, and beauty, not safety. To question the risks was almost un-American in an era when progress and mobility were everything. The contrast with today is striking. Modern vehicles come with seatbelts, airbags, backup cameras, and sensors that warn of danger before it happens. Children are secured in carefully tested car seats, and drunk driving is heavily punished. Driving today is still risky, but the protections in place make the 1950s seem almost reckless in hindsight. Looking back, it is remarkable how much faith people placed in luck and steel. What was once normal piling into a car without a seatbelt would now seem unimaginable. The very habits that gave families a sense of freedom also left them vulnerable. But it wasn't just cars. Kids faced danger even closer to home. Metal slides that burned skin. Jungle gyms on asphalt. The playground was a battlefield. For children of the 1950s, outdoor play was both a joy and a hazard, wrapped together in the same experience. The neighborhood park was a place of laughter and scraped knees, of freedom mixed with danger. Parents sent their kids out the door with little more than a reminder to be home by dinner, trusting they'd come back in one piece. What unfolded in between was often far from safe. Playgrounds were built with little thought of cushioning or protection. Tall metal swings sent kids soaring high into the air, only to crash down onto hard concrete or packed gravel. Monkey bars stretched above bare asphalt, daring children to climb higher even as the fall promised a painful landing. Slides, made of shiny steel, baked in the summer sun until they scorched the backs of young legs. Yet these were the centerpieces of fun, and children lined up for another turn, ignoring the sting and the risk. Beyond the park, bikes and skates added their own dangers. Helmets were unheard of, and knee pads were considered unnecessary. Children raced down streets, built ramps from wooden boards, and crashed spectacularly without much more than a shrug. A bloody knee or a broken arm was part of growing up, something to brag about once the cast came off. The idea of wrapping children in protective gear simply didn't exist. Some of the toys themselves were accidents waiting to happen. Lawn darts known as jarts were sold as family games, complete with sharp steel tips that could easily pierce the ground. Or a foot. Children tossed them casually in backyards, a game that sometimes ended in trips to the emergency room. Firecrackers, too, were sold directly to kids who set them off in the streets with little supervision. The snap, crackle, and boom of fireworks were as much a part of summer as ice cream trucks, even if the results could be dangerous. For parents of the 1950s, risk was not only tolerated but often seen as valuable. A few bumps and bruises were considered character building. Falling off a bike or getting burned on a slide was simply part of childhood. The culture embraced independence, and with it came exposure to hazards that today's standards would never allow. Children were expected to toughen up, and parents rarely hovered nearby to prevent every fall. Now, the contrast is dramatic. Today's playgrounds are carefully designed with rubber flooring, rounded edges, and strict safety codes. Helmets are standard for bikes and scooters, and fireworks are heavily regulated or restricted to adults. Toys like lawn darts are outright banned. What once defined childhood adventure is now remembered as reckless fun, the kind of stories grandparents tell with a mix of pride and disbelief. The playgrounds of the 1950s remind us how different the past really was. An era when risk was seen as freedom and danger came disguised as play. And speaking of unsafe, school itself had its own set of outlawed practices. In the 1950s, the classroom could feel more like boot camp. Rows of wooden desks faced a blackboard, and discipline was as much a part of the school day as reading and arithmetic. For many children, the sound of footsteps in the hallway or the creak of the teacher's chair could stir more fear than comfort. Education was taken seriously, but so was control, and the methods used to keep order would shock us today. Corporal punishment was a common tool of discipline. Teachers kept paddles, rulers, or switches at the ready, and using them was not unusual. A sharp smack across the knuckles or a trip to the principal's office for paddling was considered an effective way to keep children in line. Parents rarely questioned it, believing that strict discipline built character and respect. What would now be considered abusive was, at the time, simply part of schooling. Punishments extended beyond the paddle. A child who spoke out of turn or used bad language might find themselves with a bar of soap pressed against their lips. Washing a mouth out with soap was seen as a way to scrub away disrespect, both at school and at home. The humiliation was part of the lesson, a reminder to follow rules in a world where obedience was valued above expression. Segregation was another defining feature of many schools. Though the landmark Brown v. Board of Education ruling came in 1954, declaring segregation unconstitutional, the reality of integration was slow and uneven. In much of America, classrooms remained divided by race well into the decade and beyond. For children, this meant their education was shaped not only by strict teachers, but also by laws that enforced inequality. What was once defended as normal is now remembered as deeply unjust. Even teachers and older students contributed to the atmosphere in ways that seem shocking now. Smoking was permitted in certain areas, sometimes just outside the school doors. The smell of tobacco drifting into classrooms was hardly unusual. Teachers lit up in lounges between lessons, and high school students often had designated smoking corners. The connection between smoking and education was treated casually, almost as a rite of passage for teenagers. Curriculum content was another area with little oversight. Textbooks varied widely from one region to another, and controversial topics were often avoided altogether. Subjects like sex education were almost non-existent, while social issues were often presented in ways that reinforced conformity rather than questioning it. The classroom was designed to produce order, not curiosity, and children were expected to fit neatly into that system. Today, the shift feels dramatic. Corporal punishment is banned in most states, so punishments are unthinkable. Schools are legally desegregated, and smoking is strictly prohibited anywhere on school grounds. Curriculums face constant review, and parents are far more involved in what is taught. The practices that once defined the classroom now serve as a reminder of how much education and society has changed. But the rules outside school weren't any safer, especially on the roads. Picture Dad driving the family car with a cold beer in hand. In 1950s America, that scene wouldn't have raised an eyebrow. Drinking while driving was not only common, it was often shrugged off as harmless. There were no open container laws in many states, and having alcohol in the car was treated as little more than another part of a road trip. A six-pack on the passenger seat or a bottle tucked under the dashboard wasn't hidden. It was part of the culture of the open road. Drunk driving itself carried little of the stigma it does today. Police officers might give a warning or drive someone home rather than issue an arrest. Social gatherings often ended with guests getting behind the wheel, and no one thought much of it. Fatal accidents happened, but they were explained away as unfortunate events, not preventable tragedies. The cultural belief in personal responsibility, combined with limited law enforcement tools, left drivers free to take risks that now seem unthinkable. The risks on the road didn't stop with alcohol. Hitchhiking was a normal way to travel, especially for young people, soldiers, or anyone short on cash. Strangers stuck out their thumbs on highways, and families thought nothing of picking them up. The idea of danger from a hitchhiker or to a hitchhiker existed, but it wasn't yet ingrained in the public mind. Trust in others was still the default, and the open road was seen as a shared space rather than a threat. Even the rules of driving were far looser. Many rural areas had few posted speed limits, and where limits did exist, enforcement was often minimal. Cars sped along highways without fear of radar guns or traffic cameras. Accidents were common, but the culture of speed and freedom outweighed concerns about safety. Road trips were celebrated in songs, movies, and advertising, reinforcing the idea that the car was the ultimate expression of liberty. Children, too, were part of the risk. Riding in the back of pickup trucks was a cherished pastime, with kids laughing in the wind as trucks bounced down country roads. Families didn't consider it unsafe. It was part of growing up. Parents packed cars full of kids, sometimes with more children than seatbelts available, and no one imagined laws that would one day mandate child safety seats and booster requirements. The contrast with today is striking. Open containers are illegal in nearly every state. Drunk driving is punished severely, with strict limits, fines, and jail time. Hitchhiking has all but disappeared, replaced by rideshare apps and a stronger culture of caution. Speed limits are tightly enforced, and children are protected by layers of safety laws. The road that once symbolized unrestrained freedom is now shaped by regulations designed to prevent tragedy. What was once treated casually with beer in hand, kids in the truck bed, strangers in the passenger seat, is now tightly restricted by law. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much danger was once considered just part of the ride. And if the roads were dangerous, so were the skies. Air travel in the 1950s felt glamorous, but it came with smoke clouds and zero security. Flying was still new enough to feel like a luxury, and passengers dressed in their best clothes just to step on board. Stewardesses, as they were called then, moved gracefully down the aisles in polished uniforms, serving full meals with silverware and glassware. For many Americans, the sky symbolized elegance and progress. Yet behind the style and service, air travel operated with a casualness that would seem almost surreal today. Smoking was a given. Every seat had its own ashtray built into the armrest, and the cabin filled with layers of smoke from passengers lighting up mid-flight. There was no separate smoking section at first. Everyone simply shared the haze. Even as airlines began dividing rows into smoking and non-smoking areas, the air was still thick, and the idea of breathing clean cabin air was unheard of. For decades, this was considered completely normal, a detail of travel that no one thought twice about. Security, too, was practically non-existent. Passengers strolled directly onto planes without body scans, pat-downs, or long lines. Family members could walk right up to the gate to say goodbye, and in many cases, they could even step onto the tarmac to wave as the plane took off. Luggage was checked quickly, but almost never screened in detail. A suitcase packed with almost anything could slide through without inspection. Flying carried risks, but the concept of hidden threats had not yet shaped the way airports operated. Even the cockpit was less protected. Pilots were respected figures, but the doors to their cabins often remained unlocked. In some cases, passengers, especially children, were even invited up front to see the controls. It was a gesture of goodwill, a way to make flying feel personal and friendly. Today, the very thought of an unlocked cockpit door would trigger alarm, but back then it represented trust and openness. The differences extended to how passengers were treated once seated. Airlines prided themselves on service, offering meals on trays with real silverware and glass cups. Hot meals, carved meats, and complimentary drinks made flights feel like a moving restaurant in the sky. The idea of a pre-packaged snack bag or plastic fork would have seemed cheap in comparison. It was a golden age for passengers, at least in comfort, though safety measures were far behind. The events of later decades, especially after 9/11s, transformed air travel into what we know today. Smoking was banned entirely, cockpits were fortified, and the Transportation Security Administration reshaped the airport experience with long lines, scanners, and baggage checks. Meals became simpler, service more basic, and safety became the focus above all else. Looking back, the 1950s skies feel like a different world, glamorous. Yes, but filled with risks that no one recognized at the time. It was an age when flying was about trust, style, and freedom, long before caution and regulation took center stage. And back on the ground, one of the most shocking normals was still legal segregation. The 1950s promised comfort and tradition, but hid dangers in plain sight. Behind the smiling family portraits and tidy suburban lawns were daily practices that carried risks we can hardly imagine today. Segregation divided schools and neighborhoods, upheld by laws that told entire communities they did not belong. Censorship silenced voices and kept television, radio, and books within narrow lines of conformity. Life looked orderly, but that order came at a cost. What was presented as stability often hid injustice and fear. Even ordinary routines carried hazards that seemed shocking in hindsight. Trash burned openly in backyards, filling the air with smoke and chemicals long before pollution control became a public concern. Streets filled with children on bikes and skates, none of them wearing helmets. Playrooms held toys with sharp edges, toxic paints, and parts that could break into choking hazards. These were not seen as threats, but as part of everyday living. Parents accepted risk, often believing it built strength, while communities looked the other way. The very idea of regulation seemed distant, unnecessary, even intrusive. Looking back, it's hard to separate the nostalgia from the reality. Yes, there was a sense of freedom, kids roaming until the streetlights came on, families sharing Sunday dinners, neighbors leaving doors unlocked. But that freedom also meant a lack of protection. It meant being exposed to dangers hidden in medicine, cars, playgrounds, and schools. It meant entire groups of people being denied rights that others took for granted. The same decade that gave Americans comfort also revealed how fragile safety and equality really were. Over the decades, change came through awareness, law, and resilience. Practices once considered normal are now banned, replaced by rules meant to protect health, dignity, and fairness. Seatbelts are required, smoking is restricted, drugs are tested, segregation is outlawed, and pollution is controlled. We live with fewer risks, not because people become weaker, but because society learned from its mistakes. The memory of those dangers pushed America forward, even if progress arrived slowly and unevenly. There is something bittersweet in reflecting on the 1950s. The nostalgia is real. The ice cream trucks, the soda fountains, the neighborhood bonds. But so too is the reminder that progress was necessary. Freedom feels best when it is balanced with protection, when safety allows choice without fear. The past shows us how far we've come, not just in technology or comfort, but in the values we choose to uphold. The 1950s remain a symbol of both simplicity and struggle. They remind us that what feels normal today may one day look reckless in hindsight. And they remind us that every generation shapes its own balance of risk and safety, freedom and responsibility. Which of these 1950s everyday things surprise you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments.